This is Randy Wykoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health at East Tennessee State University, and I'm pleased to provide the public health update with data accurate through July 14th, 2022. This week, I'm going to continue the discussion that we started last week, which is what firearm-related statistics should I understand as I think about gun policy in the United States. I addressed this last week, but in the ensuing days, we've had a number of questions come in that tend to revolve around two issues. One is, where are firearm deaths occurring in the United States? We reported data last week by state, but obviously there's a great deal more detail that should be provided. And then the question that a lot of people want to know is, does owning a firearm make you safer? Now, as I mentioned, we covered firearms last week. If you haven't seen last week's update, please view it before watching this one. This one is not a complete update on firearm safety or other issues. It's really addressing the questions that came in from viewers this week. So where are firearm deaths occurring in the United States? Well, last week we talked about the fact that they vary by geography and population. We showed that firearm mortality differs by state. It's really quite remarkably different. The rate deaths per 100,000, for example, in different states are really remarkably different. As I mentioned last week, it's seldom that you see this steep a curve when you look at all 50 states. And if you compare the percent of adults living in a home with a firearm compared to firearm mortality, you do see a pretty strong relationship. But there's obviously a great deal more information about where deaths are occurring. And a recent study showed that the increase in homicides especially are located in what they call disinvested areas, basically poor parts of communities. This is looking at gun homicides, murders in Chicago in 2019 and 2020. If you look at the map on the left, the darker areas are areas with more poverty in Chicago. And you can see that the homicides typically are clustered in those areas. It's not just true for Chicago, it's true for Kansas City and Baltimore and our own Nashville, Tennessee. But we can also learn more about the distribution of gun-related deaths by population. And this report basically says two different demographic groups bear the brunt of escalating gun violence: Black men, young Black men, and older white men. This is one of the most interesting charts I've seen. Basically, here on the left, you see age, men, women, Black, white, and so on. And a death in Black is a murder, a death in blue is a suicide. And what you can see is overwhelmingly homicides, gun-related deaths in the United States from young Black men. Suicides are largely in older white men. In fact, this article goes on to conclude that white people are far more likely to kill themselves with guns than to be shot by others. Black people are more likely to be killed by someone else than to kill themselves. This is a stunning statistic. Almost 21,000 of the 40,000 homicides in the past 2 years, slightly over half, were in Black men, who make up less than 7% of the U.S. population. At the same time, white men, who make up about a little over a third of the population, accounted for 2/3 of the suicide deaths. So where are gun-related deaths occurring in America? In disinvested, poor urban centers, in those states with a greater percent of people who live in homes with firearms, and of course, for young Black men and older white men. So the question always comes up, do firearms make you safer? Well, this is an important question because that's the main reason that people buy guns. They say they have a gun 2/3 of the time for safety reasons. It's also important because the number of gun background checks are going up. Gun purchases are going up. They go up and down, but over time they seem to be going up for the purpose of safety. So does owning a gun make you safer? Well, this is not as simple as it might seem. You would think it's a pretty straightforward answer, but obviously it varies by where you live. The answer could be different in a poor urban area than in a rural area. The idea of guns is that someone's in bed at night and someone breaks into their house and they reach and get their handgun and they defend themselves in the home. But in truth, will someone have the firearm when they need it? Do they have training and experience? Is it stored safely? All of those other things. There's many, many factors. There's also factors that make it difficult to draw conclusions because, in fact, there's relatively small numbers of defensive use of firearms. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And as many of you know, there was a time period in which the CDC could not study gun-related violence. So many of the studies that we have to look at are quite old. And at the end of the day, we simply don't know how common defensive gun use is. Let's talk about that for a minute. A frequently quoted study from 1995, almost 30 years ago, concluded that there were 2 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year in the United States, a big number. That got quoted a lot, but almost immediately there was a series of counter articles that concluded that, in fact, the number was much lower, about 100,000. A more recent study suggests 1.5 million. The truth is, there's really no way to know for sure. None of these studies clearly document whether the gun use was effective. Did it deter the crime? Was it necessary? Could something else have been done? Was it beneficial? And so on. So we really don't know how, and also, frankly, most of the studies are self-reports of some sort. So who's reporting, who's not reporting? Will someone report a defensive gun use if their gun was not fired, if it was an illegal gun, and so on and so forth? So the more recent studies of defensive gun use came from an evaluation of the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's a self-report on rape, sexual assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and so on. And they analyzed 14,000 crimes, of which slightly less than 1% involved a self-defense gun use. 3/4 were by men, as we would expect. 2/3 occurred away from the home. It was actually more likely for a woman to use a defensive gun in the home than for a man. And interestingly, 80% of the defensive gun use occurred when the perpetrator did not have a gun. And that's pretty striking because often our image of a defensive gun use is someone breaks into my house and I get my gun, he has his gun, and so on. And in fact, that's not really true either because 2/3 were not in the home at all. They looked at the type of crime where a defensive gun use was used. About 1/3 were assaults, about 1/3 were property crime. They do differ by male and female. Almost 1 in 6 was a verbal threat, and then robbery was evenly distributed. But what they concluded was that the victim was injured in about 1/4 of the time in which they took some protective action, using a gun, calling the police, running away, fighting, and 11% of the time when they didn't take action. They also concluded, though, that if someone had a gun before the event takes place, if they brandish it before the physical contact occurs, that appears to reduce the risk of self, increases the risk of self-protection. But at the end of the day, the likelihood of injury when a gun was used was almost identical to when no action at all was taken. And they concluded that attacking or threatening the perpetrator with a gun had no significant effect on the likelihood of the victim being injured after taking self-protecting action. And compared to all other contact crime, those where a gun was used in self-defense was not associated with a significant reduction in the likelihood of being injured during the crime. Now, being injured isn't the only outcome of crime. Losing property is another. And you can see that if no action was taken, property was lost most of the time, with some self-protective action about half the time. When a gun was used 38% of the time, when another weapon was used 34% of the time. So the sort of the general take-home message that most people will tell you is that gun ownership doesn't significantly change crime. either numbers or outcome, but it does increase the lethality of it. But none of these studies tell us whether the net gain from having a gun, even if guns are beneficial in deterring a crime early on, which they may be, is the net benefit positive or negative? And so the question is, does having a gun in the home increase suicides, murders, or unintentional injury? Well, many of the studies here are also very old, 50 years old. There was a report that looked at homicides in 3 counties, Tennessee, Washington, and Ohio. And they basically concluded that keeping a gun in the home was strongly and independently associated with an increased risk of homicide. An odds ratio of 2.7 means about double the chance. And most of the homicides were by a family member or intimate acquaintance. This study has been challenged a lot. A more recent study that just came out this year followed adults living in California, and then those who did not have a gun, but then moved into a home where there was a gun. And what they found was that the overall rate of homicide was about twice as high for those living with a handgun owner compared to the non-owner. And it was associated with substantially increased risk of dying by homicide, especially for women. So does having a gun in the home increase homicide? Yes. Is it a major factor? I don't think we can conclude that from these numbers, except to say that it appears to be a real relationship. Again, another study from about 50 years ago looked at suicide in Tennessee and in Washington, a substantial number, and they saw a huge increase in the risk of suicide in the homes where there was a gun. This has been validated in a more recent study out of California that looked at people who acquired one or more handguns and then looked at suicide. And they said the rates of suicide by any measure were higher among handgun owners with a hazard rate of about 3.34 for men and 7 times for women. They did not have a higher rate of suicide from other methods, just guns. So they conclude that the risk of suicide by a firearm among handgun owners peaked immediately after. And some people went out and bought a gun for the purpose of committing suicide, but half of all the suicides occurred more than a year after gun acquisition. And they conclude that handgun ownership is associated with a greatly elevated and enduring risk of suicide. So where are firearm deaths in the United States? In poor communities, among young Black men and older white men, and in homes where there is greater gun ownership. Does owning a firearm make you safer? It's a tough question to answer. It may reduce your risk of injury slightly in a confrontation, or it may not. It depends on how you interpret the data. Owning a handgun may increase the risk of homicide or suicide. But again, that can be mitigated by how the gun is stored, the safety and training of the owner. So again, in both cases, I think these are questions that we have to continue to look at. I look forward to any questions that you might have. Please feel free to share this video. Thanks to Dara Young for editing, producing, and posting this video. And I should add, also adding closed captions. If you have any questions about guns, COVID, monkeypox, any evolving public health issue, please let me know. I want to make these videos as useful to you as possible. I look forward to hearing from you. Until next week, please be well.